Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Love of Wisdom Book Club. Happy Christmas to you all. This episode was actually recorded back in August, and it feels kind of weird having to wish everyone a happy Christmas given how long it's taken for me to edit and release this podcast episode. So I apologise for that. There were some things that were beyond my control that caused a lot of delays. But I'm hoping to be more on it with editing and publishing in the future, as some things in my life, touch wood, have eased off slightly. This episode was a discussion between me and my brother, and we were reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. This book has held a significant place in the culture in relation to critical race theory and conversations around racial interactions and dynamics within society at large. It has a significant influence, and although I disagree with a significant portion of the book, I thought it was important to read and engage with it, almost as important, if not more important, to engage with it based on the fact that I disagree with it, rather than be someone who is tunnel visioned on works that agree with me and reinforcing a sort of echo chamber on myself. Instead, I try to engage with things which will challenge me and which will make me look at things differently and consider alternative perspectives. I can say reasonably confidently that this book did not do a good job of persuading me of anything different, but it did make for a fruitful conversation and was a worthwhile exercise. So hopefully you gain something from listening to this, and as always, I hope you enjoy. So, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, a book you suggested, because I think you were reading it before me. What are your thoughts on this book?
I originally got it because I wanted to... I heard a lot of bad stuff about it.
Yeah.
From the right, and a lot of good stuff about it from the left. So I was like, right, I should probably read this, get a idea of it. And I read it with an open mind. There's some points in there, but for a book that's 150 pages, there's not enough. Yeah, I can see why a lot of people hate it.
Yeah. Well, so this book, when it was released, sold reasonably well, and then in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in America, it had another moment of selling a huge number of copies. And I sort of understand why, because the way everything with George Floyd was portrayed in the media, mixed with some sort of common narratives that we see, led people to feel that that was an inherently racist killing, and people felt fairly inept as to what they could do in response to this. And so I think a lot of people were sort of reeling in horror from really, what was quite a brutal thing to see, and looking for something that they could do. But I think that it's fair to say Robin DiAngelo benefited from that moment more than she probably should have, and was not deserving of the role of sort of leader of the response to the degree that she was. I know that's probably not a title she was given as such, but get the idea that I mean, she got given a position of sort of influence when people were, I guess, feeling a sense of desperation and exasperation.
Even Doodles is angry about it.
Yeah. I don't know if the limiter will block that out, but the dog is barking in the background because he's probably seen an animal outside or something like that. So apologies for that. So I think it's important, particularly in light of the sort of ongoing culture wars, as they're called, to read information that is contentious or contested and to make your own mind up on it. So I am glad that I read this book, because it would seem disingenuous for me to be hypercritical of the contents of this book without ever having actually read it myself. Not that that's ever stopped anyone on the internet. But yeah, I would agree with you that there is a lot of chaff and very little wheat within the covers of this book.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like reading it, you need to read it with an open mind and not blindly follow whatever she says. And you definitely need to, like, I don't know, you can tell she's coming from a good place, but I can anyway. I don't think you agree with me. It seems like she just genuinely really thinks that she's the person to dictate how to solve racism, and she thinks she's doing, and I'm sure she's doing a good job in a lot of people's eyes. And I mean, if it's making people feel more comfortable, if it's helping even the people that agree with her, then I've got no issue with it, really.
See, I do have an issue with it. I'm less, well, I wouldn't say I'm not generous in my interpretation of what she's trying to do. I think I do offer her some generosity in interpretation, but I think she is ideologically captured. I think she's completely possessed by her own ideas and completely blinded to the contradictions and hypocrisy and just general smoke and mirrors that is contained within her belief system. I
don't think it's solely her ideas, though. I think it's that community that embody that ideology as much as they can, that sort of feed off each other, and then she's just the one to push it more and more with the few people that she runs her like workshops with and stuff like that.
Yeah, she's not the founder of critical race theory. She's just one. She's just the next chapter of it, and there are people who've come since her. And I would say that it's basically the most prominent figures of critical race theory in the public eye have been Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I've read some of Ibram X. Kendi's work as well. I've never read a full book, but I've read passages. I've read sort of excerpts from it and a large number of quotes from him speaking. And there is a lot of crossover, but I've also read some of the historical academic basis for this as well, in terms of, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, who was sort of heralded as one of the big figures in critical race theory and the person who coined the term intersectionality. But I think that this is becoming more psychoanalyzing Robin DiAngelo rather than it is reviewing the book. But
that's what we've been doing the past 48 hours, isn't it?
Sort of, to some degree. But basically, I think what's happened is she has bought into an ideology. It really reminds me of when I've read about sort of evolutionary psychology and the idea of memetics, and there is several people have written on this concept. Richard Dawkins, when he originally came up with the idea of a meme, suggested that because a meme, being a unit of culture, is subject to evolutionary pressures. So, for example, a million ideas are put out into the world. Only a certain amount of them are going to survive over any given period of time.
Yeah.
And they must have reasons why they survive over others. Andy Norman's written about it. Steve Stewart Williams has written about it. Gad Saad has written about it. And probably many more as well. Those are just the ones that I've read writing about it. So there are multiple strategies by which a meme can be successful. One is that it points to a self-evident truth about the world, because something that points to an evident truth about the world is not going to be killed out as an idea, because people are going to observe it repeatedly. Even if everyone who had ever noticed that thing were to die out, and then a whole new wave of people were to come, they would see it again because it's just evidently true.
Right.
Another way by which a meme could replicate itself over time very successfully is by appealing to human psychology so successfully that it can almost run counter to evidence, but it basically hijacks the human psychology in such a way that it forces itself to replicate. And that's been called mind virus, mind parasite, and different sort of plays on that. But the idea is that the individual psychology and the collective psychology act as a host to an idea which replicates across time through spreading that idea to other people. And I think that what is key in this is that people naturally think in narrative. So that's partly why I think religion has been as successful and important as it is. It's why, absent religion, people have adopted ideologies, and I think that people love to spread information through stories, and we always have. Even pre-written language, we would share stories by the campfire or sort of pass them on through generations, and over time that process would filter out what's most useful and what's most appealing to the human psychology. And so I think that what she has done is she's adopted a narrative of the world that is all-consuming, because she has adopted this narrative. She can only see the world through this narrative, and that narrative replicates by selling the same story. And I think this is why, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the narrative of racist policing and that being a racist killing spread so well and sold so well in the media and was so easy for people to propagate. And throughout the whole trial of Derek Chauvin, where he was convicted of murder, not one shred of evidence was ever found for racial motivation in that. And yet the commonly held belief is that that was a racially aggravated killing. And so I think that same phenomenon, where a narrative appeals to people so much that they cannot see past the narrative, is what's happening here. And I think with Robin DiAngelo, she has made a career out of propagating that narrative. And so she's in a continuous positive feedback loop where every time she propagates that narrative, she gets praise, she gets status, she gets money, she gets all of these things. She gets to feel like she's far more intellectually capable than her work would suggest. And that's a positive feeling. And any human being who receives that sort of feedback is going to have to work very, very hard to avoid becoming corrupted by their own ego.
Right. I agree with you to some extent.
Okay.
Because back to what you were saying earlier about the, I can't even remember what you called them now, but you had the two where it like self-fulfilling narrative, and then you had one that you said if everyone died out and it replicated.
Yeah. So a meme propagating based on truth and a meme propagating based on. So the first one was relating to an evident truth. The second one was appealing to the innate structures of human psychology. And there's a third one that's useful, but I didn't mention that.
So based on the truth one, so people have an tribal bias.
Yeah.
Like, you know that. So like you said, if everyone died out, do you not think that there would be more battles between races and, if possible, enslavement and stuff like that again? I think that's probably highly likely.
I think it's almost certain, because the abolition of slavery is the anomaly in human history, which is why, without going too far off track, this is why I think people like Robin DiAngelo and the 1619 Project, and Ibram X. Kendi and other authors get it so incredibly wrong, because the thing about slavery is that it was ubiquitous across the world.
Yeah.
It was not based on whites enslaving blacks. It was everyone enslaving everyone for a very long time. And the significant change was that that England and the British Empire not only decided to end slavery based on moral grounds, while the rest of the world continued to trade in slaves until far more recently. Not only did the British Empire decide to end slavery within its own empire, it also committed a huge amount of resources to sailing across the seas and policing the end of slavery for other countries. So they would 1,500 British sailors died in the British Navy from boarding random ships, just basically in case they had slaves stowed away so that they could free the slaves. And that was how slavery started to become widely considered immoral, is through the policing of the British Empire.
Yeah. So you can see how that slavery, regardless of race, creates a hierarchy, especially if in America you have a significant amount of people that are owning slaves. Majority are white. In fact, probably, majority are white. I can't say all of them are white because I don't have those statistics. But that's going to create a hierarchy of race in those areas, and that's kind of how it's like stemmed from. Then after abolishing slavery, then that's how or America in particular, I'm sure it was everywhere that had slaves of colour in predominantly white areas, then hated the people of colour because they're just like, they're free to do whatever they want, but they're beneath us, we used to own them, blah, blah, blah. And that's then carried on. So
I yes and no. I think that there is a lot more nuance to it than simply slavery once happened and everything now is the result of everything then. I don't think history is such a linear line. I think there are a lot more nuances and complexities to it.
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously it's not just as simple as like we owned them and now we hate them. Like it's going to change over time, and it's going to be dependent on person to person. But like as a general rule, simplifying it, I know it's not a simple like fucking topic. That's sort of how it's played out, and now what we have. What we have is now just the somewhat an aftermath of that racial tension, pretty much. So I can completely understand how Robin DiAngelo has jumped to now everything's racist and every white person is racist, whether they like it or not, because we have racial biases and stuff like that. I can understand how those biases have continued into the minds of like a significant amount of people in modern days, basically.
I would be curious as to... There's two things that sort of come from that. And these are questions that I don't think are ever answered by the sort of critical race theorists. And that's why to me, it's a massive hole in everything they're doing. One of massive holes. But how long a period of time and does it has to pass before you no longer consider that to be the the primary cause of differences or a significant cause of differences, and what constitutes sufficient evidence to say that one, slavery is the cause of any inequalities that exist now, and two, that an inequality is caused by something other than slavery. What's the threshold for evidence in those cases?
Well, there's one answer that you'll probably agree with. It depends how long it takes for the money to dry out. But yeah, it's always going to be a difficult question to answer though, because it's not something that's easily measured. Just like you were saying, the George Floyd trial, you were saying how there was no sufficient evidence to prove that it was racially motivated.
I said not no sufficient evidence, no evidence whatsoever.
Right, okay. But how do you get that evidence? Where is the evidence other than him admitting that he did it because George Floyd was black? Like, that you can't go back and check, like, if he was policing a predominantly black area, you can't go and check like, does he do this to all the white people that he arrests as well as all the black people? You can't have you can't really measure that statistic. He hasn't, I can't remember if he's killed anyone before or not, anything like that.
Not that I'm aware of.
I didn't follow the trial, to be fair. But it's not something that's easily measured unless someone admits it. And then even then, you have people who will have subconscious biases, or everyone's got a subconscious bias against pretty much everything, especially like
everyone hates everything.
No, but like we're gonna have like racial. We're probably gonna have like racial bias, but not just racial bias, like class bias and stuff like that. Everyone's got biases. Whether it's you can't just say like white people have biases against people of color because people of color have biases against white people, and like so on and so forth, and rich people have biases against poor people and vice versa, and like there's just subconscious biases everywhere. So like if he doesn't admit it, how do we know that it's not racially charged through a subconscious bias, or like say that he just acted a certain way that then triggered that subconscious bias and then caused them to do that or whatever? It's impossible to measure.
Well, this is an issue. I think that there are things you can use to approximate an answer. You would, if you found, because inevitably throughout his arrest and his trial, his phone records are going to have been explored, his previous conduct is going to have been explored, and all these things. And if there was any suggestion of racial bias within that they could find anywhere within that, they would almost certainly have brought it as evidence, because that was the narrative surrounding the killing. Second of all, you can look at, because the claim is that whether or not Derek Chauvin was a racist, and to me, that's very much secondary because he's a murderer, and that's sort of the most significant, the most significant issue at hand there. But you can look at, so the claim was not that necessarily that it was individual, but that it was institutional. That gets even more murky, but you can look at the research of, say, Roland Fryer, who looked at rates of police violence and police killings by race to explore this. And I have watched a number of interviews with him. First of all, he's a black man, he's an economist, and he has openly admitted that his expectation was that he would find evidence of racial bias. So he was not looking to disprove this, he was expecting to find it. So he looked through all the records of police violence and police killings and all this. He found that there was no difference in the rates at which police in comparable encounters of someone who is armed, there is no difference in the rates at which police shoot white people and black people.
Wait, did you say when they're armed?
Yeah, so comparable cases, because obviously you can't compare. So you can't compare apples and oranges by saying, well, there was 100 traffic stops on people of this ethnicity, but not one of them had a gun, and there was 100 traffic stops on this ethnicity, but 3 of them had a gun, and 2 of the 3 people with a gun got shot, so it's racist. Because you have to control for the variables.
I get that, but surely it'd make more sense to compare instances where they're unarmed.
So when it comes down to non-lethal violence was used against black people slightly more often than white people, but the race of the police officer didn't matter. Black police officers were just as likely to use force against black a suspect is the word I was looking for. I was going to say like alleged offenders, but I was like, suspects as white police are.
Yeah.
So then you have to question, is the issue racial or is it something else? And that would suggest that it's something else. Now, there might be a product of, say, if you think of like an area, because this research was done in the States, if you think of an area like Baltimore, for example, very high crime rate, predominantly black, there might be a case that police in that area have such frayed relations with the local populace that they are almost expecting aggression, and so going out with a more aggressive mindset themselves.
Yeah.
That's not racism. That is just processing information. But it is a problem that needs solving. But the problem can only be solved if we identify it accurately.
Well, that goes to one of the things that, kind of one of the things that Robin DiAngelo mentions, because obviously if you're talking about a black police officer, then it doesn't really tie into the idea that she's saying, because it's the whites who are racist and blacks can't be racist, blah, blah, blah. But I suppose if you're looking at the way that people are taught through police academies and stuff like that you need to be alert, especially in like high crime areas, which a lot of them, I don't want to say a lot of them are predominantly black, but in America, like places like Baltimore, you have like a predominantly black city who a lot of the crime is produced in poorer neighborhoods, which are more populated by people of color. What was I going to say?
You were looking at police academies and the training.
She was basically saying that like a white person has been shown in studies. I haven't looked at the study, so I don't know whether it's accurate or not. Probably not, but that's probably my bias kicking in. But like when a white person, in her example, is walking down the street and sees a black person, a significant amount of time, they automatically have a fear response to some degree. So I suppose if that, what I'm saying is that if the police are going into dangerous areas and stuff like that, it's the same sort of idea that they will have that like fear response and they will be looking to protect themselves, just as they're taught in like police academies and stuff like that. and then they're more likely to overreact in situations based on their fight or flight.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, this is something that I've heard Coleman Hughes and John McWhorter, and I think I've heard Lex Friedman talk about it at points as well, is how we improve police training to improve effective and clear-headed decision-making in situations of conflict, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. There is good research on psychological perceptions where under stress people almost sort of like predict what they're going to see, or see things as they might not be. So like there have been examples of police shooting someone for pulling out a camera, for example, and the police officer says, well, I thought it was a gun. And the way our psychology works, it's entirely possible, if not likely, that that person did see it as a gun at that time. We don't want people being shot for having cameras, so we need to figure out how we address that. But that's about how do we recognize the difficulty of the job that police are doing and the complexities of those situations, because the vast majority of the people who are making, who are saying the police should have made better decisions in that moment, that's a very polite version of what most of them are saying.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to argue that any of them would have been any more capable of making a more better judgment in that situation, given the circumstances that prevail.
Yeah, none of them would though. Like you see these comments on all sorts of videos online and stuff like that. Not even just to do with like police and things like that. Just people it's like, if I was in that person's situation, I'd do it like this and I would do better. And people just love to think that like in high stress environments they'd be able to react perfectly. And in reality, only I'm referring more to sports and stuff here, but only the very top people are actually able to do that, because they're actually able to relax their nervous system and get rid of that fight or flight response. And yeah,
we saw it in the UFC recently. Amanda Nunes's last fight, I think it was. I can't remember the name of the woman she was against, but this is like this is a big match. Title shot for her, and so she is one of the, to get to that point she has to be one of the most elite female fighters in the world, and she got into the ring and she absolutely froze and hardly threw a punch through the whole fight, got completely dominated, and she looked like she didn't know what she was doing. And that was one of the best trained people to deal with that situation you ever get. And so if at an elite level you can't expect that level of clarity and people still have those responses, then there has to be a realism about other situations for people who aren't as well trained as that. Because, so look, there's a trade-off here, isn't there? We want police to be highly trained to deal with these situations as best as they can. The higher you put the bar for quality of policing, the harder it is to recruit police, because the fewer people are going to get through it. Do you accept having less police, which all the evidence would show lower levels of policing tend to increase the crime rate, and having a police presence in terms of out patrolling and engaging with the community and things like that have a positive effect on bringing down the crime rate, which I think, apart from perhaps a few anarchists out there, most people would agree that lower crime rates are probably for the better.
And criminals.
Criminals.
They like crime.
They only like their own crime. Then you sort of get stuck in this situation of like, okay, where is the sweet spot where police are we have to accept some imperfections from the police in order to address the crime rates, and we have to, but we aren't willing to sacrifice the crime rates at a certain point in order to have more effective policing, because you're constantly weighing those against each other. You can't have 100% of both.
Yeah, I you know what? I know it's hindsight, but if you look at the deaths in the UK to do with police compared to the US, it's just ridiculous, because we don't have hardly anyone has guns. There's quite a lot of people with guns on the street and that, but it's not like they're gonna pull out guns against police and stuff like that. It's like a very rare occurrence. So, but now at this point you can't be like, the police can't use guns in America because loads of other people have guns. So it's like, it's difficult, because it's also the issue of, from my understanding in America, and I know I'm sure in the UK, police get underpaid, especially working in rough neighborhoods where they're putting their lives in danger all the time. So the trade-off for people who want to join the police isn't great, because it's like, right, I'll have a good pension, but will I survive that long to get my pension? And I feel like since they're trying to recruit so many people, the answer would be increase the pay for it. More people will want to do it. But then also you'll probably attract a lot of people who are doing it purely for the money rather than, I don't know.
And you have to find that money from somewhere, and you have to weigh that against, because it's public money. It's like, what else could that have been spent on? Where else is it going? And this is why politics is so complicated as it is, because there's 10 million things you could be spending money on, and there's always people arguing in favor of every single one of them, and you're constantly having to weigh that up.
Yeah. So in my opinion, the solution would be start using the money that you're taking from drug dealers and stuff like that to pay the police, but obviously it's not that simple.
No, there's probably, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I suspect that there is laws about appropriating funds that are seized as part of an investigation, because it makes it very ethically grey.
Yeah.
But there was something we sort of waylaid into the complications of policing, but I wanted to ask you, because when you were talking about Derek Chauvin, you were saying that the argument is that there's an unconscious bias there, and we do all suffer from unconscious bias. I have some points to make on the unconscious bias thing as represented by DiAngelo in the book, but my question that always comes up when I read these authors is, if a bias is unconscious and we're only aware of it through controlled experiments where we can measure that these biases exist, and these biases could be based on many different things. Actually, this is the point that I was going to hold on to, but to say a bias is based on race is presumptive at best, because one of the things she focuses on is it's always whites having bias against other ethnicities, but other ethnicities have their own bias against all different races as well. But it gets far more nuanced than that, because you'll see, for example, like tribes in Africa who are very hostile towards people with a slightly different eye color or things like that. Because we've evolved tribally, we detect difference or any indication of difference, and so that bias could be based on the skin color, It could be based on the body language. It could be based on accent. Accent's a huge one. People are more comfortable with someone of a different ethnicity but the same accent than they are with someone with a different accent of the same ethnicity, if that makes sense. So people would be more comfortable. The research sort of generally indicates that a white person would be more comfortable with a black person. A white English person would be more comfortable with a black person with an English accent than they would be with a white person with a South African accent, for example. They see more similarity there. It could be based on dress. It could be based on mannerisms. It could be based on choice of language. So it could be based on all these sort of things, but there is a presumption that race is the overriding one in every case within these books. But if that unconscious bias can only be detected in test conditions, and that it's unconscious, so the person who's doing it is unaware, then how do we presume that the people external to that individual who are making the allegation of unconscious bias are in any better of a position to see that unconscious bias? And how are they supposed to know what's going on in someone's mind when someone else doesn't know what's going on in their mind? To me, it's very presumptive and slightly arrogant.
Well, that's exactly it. This is the issue that I think we touched on when we did the Coddling American Mind book. Mine's gone blank.
About biases and knowing what's inside someone else's mind.
Ah, Jesus Christ.
Don't do drugs, kids.
Yeah, it really fucks with your memory. Just an FYI, I've been sober a while now. Just it's long-lasting effects. What did you just say a minute ago?
I said that biases could be caused by all sorts of things other than race, and it's presumptive to think it's race, and that how do we know what's going on in someone else's mind when they are supposedly not aware? Microaggressions.
So basically what we were talking about when we did the book before was that is there I can't remember who it was, but someone said that microaggressions don't need intent behind them. And this is the thing that I struggle with, because basically what you're saying is a microaggression is anything that someone else finds offensive and doesn't like. So what people will do is they'll put their own interpretation on what you say and then claim that since they feel that it is meant a certain way, then it must be meant a certain way, and that you can't say any different because you're just denying that you've committed a microaggression or that you're racist or whatever. And it doesn't make sense to be able to just be like, I don't like what you said, so I'm right, you're wrong. It's just backwards. And yeah, there's just loads of instances in this book that are basically just her presuming that someone meant something in a certain way and then claimed that that person's racist for it. Like the one that stands out the most for me is that a woman was telling a story and she basically was saying that a black woman said that you don't, like, shouted, you don't understand our kids or whatever. And she did it in a way that imitated the woman's voice. And everyone's just like, that's racist because you imitated a black woman's voice. And it's just like, she didn't say that she was black or anything like that. But everyone knew that she was black from the way she imitated the voice. And it's just like, one, how do you know that imitation isn't perfect? like, because they say that's a stereotypical black woman. The woman could be a stereotypical black woman and sound like that. Like, they don't know it, but they're automatically just like, right, that's racist because you sound black when you're saying it. And obviously, I personally don't think the woman meant any offense by that, especially considering she was sharing it in front of people of color in a meeting about racism. And it just like, okay, maybe it offended someone, but if you offend someone and you don't intend to, unless it's like obviously racist, like, and like, I don't really know how you'd be able to determine whether something is obviously racist unless you use like the N-word and stuff like that in a derogatory way. But yeah.
Well, I think this is a theme that was present all throughout the book, and very explicitly, where she said she doesn't think intent matters and that it's all about impact. And that is very dangerous, because ultimately that means that anyone can make an accusation at any point, and innocence or guilt, innocent before proven guilty being a fundamental principle of a free country, guilt is assumed and there is no process that you can go through. Like, for an experiment, according to the rules of this book, I now put it to you that you're a racist and I want you to defend yourself.
No defense needed.
No defense needed.
I have black friends.
So she addresses that. Having black friends doesn't mean anything.
Even though she specifically points out how many black people she's friends with throughout the book.
Yeah, constantly. There are some really blatant hypocrisies within this book, and it's painful at times. So you can't point to your track record of a lack of animosity towards the people in question. So no amount of evidence of good relationships with black people is proof that you don't hate black people, weirdly. And you can contest it. You can get angry, get upset, because that would be white fragility, and that would just be you not willing to accept it. If you accept it, well, then it's proven because you accepted you're a racist. And it's basically just a rhetorical trick.
Yeah.
That puts you in a trap where you can't get out of it no matter what. But this is created by the fact that she uses a very interesting definition of racism.
Yeah, I was just about to point out that you said that if you admit it, then you hate black people or whatever. But she redefines racism in a completely, well, I wouldn't say a completely new way, but institutional racism, basically, which she says you can be racist and not hate blacks. You can be a white supremacist and not hate blacks, but you just basically, yeah.
It's not a completely new way, because it is the way that critical race theorists have been defining it for a while. It's not the commonly understood definition of racism, and I would argue it's quite an unworkable definition of racism.
What do you mean by unworkable?
So her definition of racism, by my understanding, is living in a society that some people would deem racist a priori. There's no need for evidence. It's just a presumption that the society is racist. And being white. I mean, basically, her definition of racism is if you're white, you're racist.
It's pretty much if you're a majority and you live in a country that has specifically prioritized whites in things like advertising and portraying whites as the perfect family and stuff like that, through like TV and so on and so forth, then you're basically saying that it is the superior race, and then in reaction to that, you are oppressing people of color, and even though you're not directly doing it, your internal image of being white and being superior is causing that racism, basically.
That's sort of loosely it, but I don't think she uses the being in the majority thing, because she doesn't acknowledge that the same thing would happen with Chinese people in China, where they would make up the vast majority of people on TV and everything like that. And and in India, it would be Indians who make up the majority of people on TV and things like that, just as it would be Arabs in Arabic countries, it would be Slavics in Slav countries. It's like, and this is one of the things that is completely confused throughout the whole book, is that many things that are just a case of minority majority dynamics, some of which are unavoidable. I'll give an example to show what I mean. But some of these unavoidable majority minority dynamics, she just presumes that they are about race, and everything's about race, and the only person who can ever be the one with power, because she's postmodernist influence, so she believes that everything comes down to power, can be white people based on generational guilt because of things that actually had very little to do with anyone who's alive today, because they happened several hundred years ago.
Yeah.
I think it was 1860 something was the end of slavery, or something like that.
Yeah, it's 65.
Something like that. It was mid 19th century. And the example that she used, the hilarious example she used about the discomfort of feeling in a minority, which she spoke about being invited to her white friend's picnic, and she said she was coming down the hill and saw that there were two picnics going ahead on opposite sides of the path, and one of them was entirely populated by black people, one of them entirely populated by white people. She then said she was unsure about which one to go to, which doesn't particularly make sense because it's fairly obvious if you're looking for a white friend to go to the group of white people. And then speaks about her relief at having not had to interact with the black people, and extrapolates this this sense. And I'm not going to call her racist for that. I'm not. You could make an argument that she's racist for it, but she extrapolates from that all people must feel the same and it must be based on race. But actually, if you are a tall person in a room full of short people, you notice. If you're a short person in a room full of tall people, you notice. If you're the only person wearing a tracksuit in a room full of people in suits, you notice. If you're like, people notice things that make them a minority in a given situation. Like, I go into work every day and I'm the only man in an office full of women, and I'm aware of that. And all the time. It's social work. There's very few men.
I was referring more to the fact that you might be a woman, to be fair.
Well, I self-identify as a man, and so you can't tell me otherwise.
Noted. I don't want to get cancelled there.
Too late. But that, not only am I aware of that intuitively because it's just obvious, I am also made aware of it by the fact that I will get requested to do jobs that people think are more appropriate for a man. There will be conversations about it. There will be jokes about it and things like that. So, and that's fine, because I recognise that's just part of being slightly different, because men and women are different, at the risk of getting cancelled again. And so being in a minority is always going to bring about that potential for uncomfort, particularly if you're interacting with a group of people you don't know.
Yeah.
And so that's why she's less generous with herself than I am. Although she turns it around to talk about how great she is, because that's what 90% of the book is. She calls herself a racist, whereas I'm not prepared to do that, because I think she was just having a reasonable experience based on the situation.
Yeah, well, she tries to minimize what. I feel minimize what racism is a bit of an extreme way of putting it. But she tries to make it less damaging to your social perception. Like, she constantly says throughout the book that racism isn't like, if you're racist, you're automatically bad. If you're not racist, you're not automatically good.
Yeah,
like,
but you are automatically racist, regardless of whether you're good or bad.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, I feel like there's quite a few points in the book where she's just attempting to. Well, she just continuously calls herself racist in various different ways to try and make people comfortable with being racist.
But then tells stories about how black people have told her she's so much better than all the other racists.
Yeah, pretty much. She's an exceptional racist. She is
exceptionally racist. You're right.
But yeah, nothing better than a pat on the back saying you're not that bad of a racist.
But this is why I think that her definition of racism and the critical race theorist definition of racism is unworkable. If you trivialize racism to such a degree that everyone is a racist regardless and there's nothing you can do to defend yourself, what incentive exists in society for people to no longer be racist?
Well, the idea is that we all live in harmony and go to church and stuff like that.
No, I doubt that she wants us to go to church. It's very, very unlikely that anyone who's bought into this stuff is vocal or strong proponent of religion. They've already got their religion.
Yeah. It just seems like, well, obviously it's just everyone being equal and we all live in harmony and nothing bad ever happens and so on and so forth.
But so one of the major ways that we have gotten to become, by all reasonable measures, the least racist society that's ever existed, one of the ways we've gotten to that position is by creating a social stigma about being racist. People made the moral argument based on the inherent value of the individual, everyone being equal in the eyes of God, because it was Christians who made the original moral arguments in favour of the end of slavery.
And the Ku Klux Klan on it. They're Christian, aren't they?
Yeah, but I don't see how you would make the argument against slavery without believing that all people are created equal, and that argument existed principally from Christianity,
yeah,
or Judeo-Christianity. So from that, we then outlawed slavery, deciding it was immoral, and over time, we have increasingly made it socially stigmatized to be racist. There's a reason why people react badly to being called racist, and that's because it is seen socially as a negative thing to be.
Yeah, but she's pointing that out in the book. Plenty of points.
But then what she's trying to do is say that we should destigmatize racism, because actually everyone needs to admit to being racist all the time, because we are all racist all the time, and it's not a big thing to be called a racist. You just have to continue to be working on it. But what incentive do people have to address that if there is no stigma against racism? Because basically what she said, what anyone who is has some racist convictions will be thinking is, well, I'm going to be called racist anyway, so what's the point in hiding it?
Yeah, But this is it. When as racism got seen as more and more bad throughout like the 1900s and after slavery and stuff like that, it basically ended up with people starting to be more closeted racist rather than, obviously some people just saw everyone as equal, like you said, and weren't, I don't want to say inherently racist because racial biases and stuff like that. But yeah, it caused a lot of people to be more closeted racist, and this could equally just be like, stop that, like you said, and people come out. But then you've also got the benefits of the significant amount of virtue signaling these days, and being as not racist as possible is still seen as a good thing. So you still got that incentive of being a better person and also being seen better in the eyes of people of colour and stuff like that by becoming less and less racist. So there's still that incentive there. It's same as everything. Everything's like a double-edged sword, and you're gonna have pros and cons. You're gonna have people who are now like, if I'm being called racist anyway, then I'm just gonna be my usual racist self and be open about it. Whereas you're gonna have other people who are just like, this makes me want to be better. And
I would say, from what I've witnessed, and obviously this is subjective and anecdotal, I would say that the critical social justice approach to calling everything racist all the time, and redefining racism away from the commonly held definition, because the vast majority of people still define racism as unjust prejudice against people based on their ethnicity or skin colour.
Yeah.
A nice, easy, workable definition of racism. And the vast majority of people adhere to that. I think I've seen more people who have just gone, well, you can't say anything nowadays, or everything's called racist nowadays, who have no interest in gaining social status or applause and credit for avowing their racism or demonstrating how virtuous they are, because that only gains you credit in a very small section of society who are advocates of the critical social justice approach. And most people look at that crowd and listen to them politicizing everything and turning everything into everything's about race or gender, or it's just the same boring, predictable script. And it is really boring. They are important conversations to be had that have been robbed of any value they have as a conversation by being completely trivialized and said all the time. And yeah, people don't care for social status in those environments because most people just want to be left alone by those people, not included by them.
Yeah, well, this is it. It's not specific to like racism and gender and stuff like that anymore, is it? It is literally just it's so dominant online because that's where you see that's where you interact with people the most. That's where you interact with the most people, is through social media. And it is just, social media has created a what's it called?
Echo chamber?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's got echo chambers, but then it also it shows people things that they will disagree with because it will get the most reaction, and it is made everyone, well, not everyone, but the people who use social media the most and the people who are like chronically online, a significant majority, well, I can't say a significant majority, a significant majority of people who are commenting on what you see is all negative, and it has conditioned people to just argue. And they don't, it's not really like, everyone will have a bias on the argument, and they will not be able to see outside of their bias. And it is just transferred into everything. You go on like gym TikToks and stuff like that, people have been like, oh, you only bench that, you can't bench 225, your form's terrible. Like, every girl gets slewed by gym guys on Instagram and stuff like that, and TikTok. And then you've got it on political stuff. Facebook's the worst in terms of political stuff. Instagram and TikTok's all just superficial, just
X.
I've never used Twitter, and I've never used X. So
I like the fact that X has become X, formerly known as Twitter. Like,
well, obviously, but it was Twitter since like the original.
I know, but everywhere it's written, so X is obviously supposed to be a bit more snappy, a bit more cool. It's like the artist formerly known as Prince. You know, everywhere I see it written, it's like X brackets, formerly known as Twitter.
It's getting longer and longer, isn't it? But yeah, no, it's just like I don't use Twitter, X, whatever. I don't know why I did air quotes there. But yeah, it's just like, I remember, like I've said this on your podcast before, it's like using Facebook chronically and just arguing with people for the sake of it, and it's just so bad for your mental health. But you get addicted to it, and then you just get lost in just constant arguing with strangers, usually about topics that you don't actually educate yourself much more on. You just have a view that is usually manipulated by other people's comments, and then you just run with it. And yeah.
Well, this is I'll try and tie it slightly back to the book. So basically what I've seen happen, and my perception of it, is that it's a mismatch evolutionarily between how we normally form tribes and bonds, and how that is done online. And the reason I think that's mismatched is because we would have a limited tribe. Dunbar's number says you'll only ever have, I think it's 100 close friends or friends within your lifetime or something like that. So we have to find ways of filtering who we speak with. Yeah. And I think that people will generally filter for those that they have the most in common with and the most similarities.
Yeah.
What doing it online does is it removes all of the physical context to some degree. So someone is basically just a name and an avatar. You're not necessarily judging them by their appearance. So skin color becomes less important. The way they dress becomes less important. And all these different things. It's Robin DiAngelo's dream to some degree, apart from
your
she wants to
opinions is what matters most.
Basically. Yeah, so what you're saying becomes what matters most, and that could be seen as a positive thing, but then in trying to filter the people that we speak to, people, unless they make a conscious effort, will find people who mostly agree with them on as many things as possible, and then it creates these sort of echo chambers, and these echo chambers get very polarized because the tribal behavior comes out, and it's sort of you feel animosity towards the people who don't share your views, because you've sort of reached your limit of number of people you can connect with. Now, that's probably not happening for everyone, but what the platform does do is give an outsized voice to people who are likely to post, who are likely to portray negative behaviors. So you have more issues with people who are on the dark tetrad sort of personality spectrum, so people who are maybe higher in Machiavellianism or narcissism or psychopathy or sadism, will be more represented amongst those who are engaged in vocal outrage and troll-like behavior. So and then people cluster around them. So the sort of tribal groups get clustered around the outspoken people. That's sort of my perception of how it's working. And what has generally been shown to work in terms of easing tensions between tribal groups where there is division is that if you find a unifying group which both tribes belong to, then that will ease the tensions. So there was an experiment where, I can't remember the names of the artists now, but there was basically a group of people who were asked what painting they liked more, whether it was by this artist or that artist, and then were randomly assigned to different groups, but they were told that they were assigned according to the painting they'd picked. So the presumption was in their mind that they were with a group of people who'd all picked the same painting.
Yeah.
But by randomly assigning it, you'd controlled for any potential biases that might make someone like one painting over the other. And when you gave them money to pass out between the two different groups, they would advantage the group of people who they believed liked the same painting as them. So the tribal groupings can be based over things that are very, very arbitrary. They did another one where people had to estimate the number of dots on a page and then and that had the same outcome. Whereas I was reading some stuff by Henry Tarfel documenting the easing of racial tensions in, I think it was Israel, but it might have been somewhere else, where basically there was two sort of ethnic groups who there was a lot of animosity between, and he basically looked at the different conditions in the areas where those tribal groups coexisted more peacefully and where there was more tension. And the thing that made them coexist more peacefully was when they had another identity that they both fit within, so members of a certain country or something like that. So what Robin DiAngelo does when she racializes everything and makes everything about whether you are white or whether you are black or whether you are Latinx, to use the grating word du jour, then if that is seen as the most fundamental aspect of your character, you are probably going to increase the tension between other groups because that's how group lines are then drawn.
Yeah, that's kind of how I view it, but I'm not too sure. One of the things that reminded me of actually when you were speaking was in the book when she starts talking about how racism manifests from a very young age and how they put a bunch of 3-year-olds in a room and they're like monitored, and then they're like monitored when with an adult in the room and monitored without an adult in the room. And basically she says that the white toddlers discriminated against the black ones in both settings, but then as I think the other group was like 8 or 9 or something like that, she was just like, they're only racist when the adult's not in the room. So it makes me wonder, one, whether that study's accurate, because I'm not sure if that tribal instinct of race would really come into effect at that young. So
I think it would. Because I think if you look at research on babies and where they where their eyes go and where they give attention, they tend to notice difference more. And so there's been a few studies that have sort of said, oh, well, babies will look at someone who's a white baby will look at someone who's black for longer. And people have then tried to draw conclusions from that.
Would that not be based on curiosity rather than like racism?
100%. It'd be based on the fact that as a white baby, they've got white parents, and therefore the black adult is more novel, and so they have to do more figuring out.
Yeah, and it's also like if they haven't experienced that as many times as they've experienced their white parent, then they're gonna be more interested in it because they're learning about the world and everything like amazing or scary or whatever. But that's what I'm saying. It makes me wonder how they would be able to measure the racism in the toddlers. Basically, like, because they're not going to do it by how long they stare at the other toddlers. Like, well, personally, I don't think that's how it would be. I'd need to look at the study, really.
No.
But,
well, there aren't very many studies linked in throughout the text. It's very sparse on evidence, but I think that it would be so. This, to me, oh, now I've forgotten what I was about to say. So, what were you saying again? You were saying about the wanting to see
about how they would measure racism in toddlers. Basically.
I've got it. So, she presumes throughout the book, and she makes this very obvious through her use of the word equity. She works on the presumption that any form of any form of unequal outcome is the result of discrimination.
Yeah.
And that baby one, or toddler one, made me think of that. I can't remember the exact details of it, but if, say, a white kid wanted to play with another white kid more often than a black kid, she would presume that that's based on race and it's based on discrimination. And there were studies where she blatantly did that, where it was like the information that were gleaned from the studies did not inherently lead to the conclusion she drew, and there was plenty of other explanations, but because she's ideologically possessed, there's only one answer to everything. And I think this is, well, it's where the crossover between critical race theory and Marxist communism becomes most obvious, because it's entirely based on the idea that outcomes should be completely equal across groupings, regardless of input.
Yeah.
And there's a very easy way to demonstrate how absurd this is, because if I gave you an equation that said x plus 3 equals, and x could represent 4 or 6, would the outcome be the same for the equation were you to put in the 4 or the 6?
Well, no.
No, because the outcome would be 7 or 9. And so the only way you can presume equal outcomes to be achieved, to happen, the only way it could possibly happen is on the presumption that every input is identical. So you basically ignore all human variance. And we can give examples when this has happened along ethnic lines in recent times, because COVID-19. Black people were disproportionately affected by COVID-19 within this country, but the causative mechanism for that is that darker skin. It happened the other way around because we originate from Africa. So darker skin absorbs less vitamin D because it's closer to the equator, and so there's more sunlight around, and it needs to protect against the ultraviolet rays. And then when people migrated around the world, the further away from the equator you got, the paler your skin became, because there was less sunlight and a greater need to absorb vitamin D and a less need to protect against ultraviolet rays. Now people move around the world more freely, and so people with dark skin are in the UK, despite that not being where dark skin was evolved. That's not the environment of evolutionary adaptation. And so they're more likely to be vitamin D deficient. And so when something that one of the primary defenses against it is healthy rates of vitamin D, or one of the comorbidities is vitamin D deficiency, then the people who are vitamin D deficient had greater rates of impact.
Is that definitive? Like,
it's fairly well evidenced.
No, yeah, but surely that's. Well, I mean, it could be the main cause of the increase in damage of COVID on black people in the UK, but I feel like there's probably more factors to that than just pure
there could be
D deficiency.
There could be more factors, but there's no way that wouldn't be a significant one.
Is
because
vitamin D deficiency
it's a significant
heavy impact on?
Yeah, it's a significant comorbidity for COVID.
Right.
So and that's just based off of one thing. That's one very. It has a significant consequence from actually what is a fairly small difference, because it's the level of melanin in your skin. People who are advocates for equal outcomes, first of all, people jumped to the narrative that this is a result of systematic racism, which, unless you're going to argue the solar system is systemically racist because
I've
it doesn't
had a feeling about the sun,
because it doesn't distribute sun rays equally across the entire globe, then you're in a you're on shaky ground with that claim. But one of the things that happened in some states in America, and that was advocated for in a number of situations, was priority access to vaccination for people based on race.
Right.
And that is very legally and ethically tricky, because then you're discriminating by race.
So that was a proven.
Well, it was an active policy in parts of America.
Damn.
They were.
I can see why she wrote this book now.
But they were prioritizing black people.
Oh right. Shit. Sorry. Misunderstood.
Yeah. I saw some more sensible ideas that were worth greater exploration come from the UK. There was one about perhaps having vitamin D supplements available. I think you could do that in a targeted way, but I think to do it based on race would be ethically questionable. So I think you could in areas that were identified as more likely to experience high rates of severe impact of COVID-19, you could prioritize them when you're distributing supplements, for example, and that would have a positive effect for both malnourished whites and blacks.
Why would that be problematic though, if it has been proven that the vitamin D deficiency has a bigger impact on people of colour? Having an issue with that, having an issue with the distribution being given to purely or mainly people of colour would be the same as having an issue with vaccines being given to elderly first.
I would disagree, because I think that age is the comorbidity itself, whereas race is not the comorbidity. The vitamin D deficiency is the comorbidity.
Yeah, but if it's having a significant impact.
But what about goths? So I'm that's me being slightly. But what about white people who are vitamin D deficient as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, there would still be.
If the issue is vitamin D deficiency, it would make more sense to me that it is based on testing for vitamin D levels rather than being based solely on race.
Yeah, I agree. But then, I'm just playing devil's advocate here now. I'll leave it. I was going to go down a wormhole of whether which old people would have a bigger risk, and based on like heart disease and things like that, or like lung disease.
Yeah. Well, there was tiers of prioritization, wasn't there? Because there was people with significant comorbidities that put them at increased risk, who were on shielding and things like that, who were given priority over healthy people.
Because I think asthma was one of the things that
depended on the severity of your asthma as to where you were given priority.
No, yeah, that's fair.
And then they did some stuff in terms of employment and lines of employment that were most likely to bring you into contact with it.
Well, healthcare work and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was because I fell into that bracket, but realistically, I think that they probably could have done that in a way. But this is a whole other conversation, and I suspect it took place. It probably took place with many ethicists and people debating how to prioritize that, because it's a difficult thing. But so my original point was the about her philosophy of equal outcomes.
Yeah, well, we've discussed this in various different ways. Specifically, the one of, well, we were discussing about it last night, about how poor areas tend to be more densely populated with people of colour, and white areas are more densely populated with, or rich areas are more densely populated with white people, basically. And that then they have their own advantages and disadvantages. More disadvantages for the poor and more advantages for the rich, basically. But yeah, there's too many aspects, and one of the more well-known ones is when they're talking about people in construction and stuff like that, specifically like women, not so much race, and men in like healthcare and jobs that require more empathy than hardiness. So you can't really force people into picking these things, and people's mental traits sometimes, well, a lot of the time based on gender and stuff like that, is going to have impact on where they choose to go in life and their decisions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I'd be willing to bet. Well, actually, I don't need to bet on it because Thomas Sowell's explored it in one of his books, and I'm struggling to remember which one now. But if you look at industry by industry, based on ethnicities, different ethnicities tend to be disproportionately represented in different industries, usually based on cultural values. So I think I'm trying to remember. There was who was it? He said there was some ethnicity that tended to work significantly in the textile industry and have a lot to do with fashion. I think it might have been Jews tend to work in the fashion industry quite a lot. Then Indians tend to have a lot of sort of like doctors and lawyers. Are sort of like these cultures where there is a high expectation of socially state highly socially regarded sort of professions like doctors and lawyers.
And that's the same with whether that's usually countries that are more what is it?
Strict?
No, not
disciplinary.
Strict. They not disciplinary. Like the way their culture works, like in Asia, it's like or China specifically, it's like a.
It's very hierarchical in terms of family.
Kind of, yeah. There's a specific word for it, but I can't remember.
Honor?
Yeah, honor system.
Honor culture.
Yeah, honor culture, that's it.
Yeah. It's because of the connection with family in terms of you bring honor to your family through your
like social status and stuff like that, by getting a good job and being able to provide for your parents when they get old and things like that.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. I can see how that would link in, but generally, it's one of the big contradictions in the book, I would say, because she talks about diversity, but also advocates for equal outcomes. And the only way to achieve equal outcomes is to retard diversity. And the only way to achieve diversity is to sacrifice the equality levels in outcome.
And freedom of choice.
Yeah.
Essentially. So, it's just like, to me, it feels like not the whole situation, but the equality of outcome is fighting a battle for the sake of fighting a battle. Like, I understand trying to, making equal opportunity for people, and which is almost impossible as is, because people are going to have different forms of I was going to say diversity. What is it?
Attributes?
No. The difficulties in their life. Like they're gonna come into more, like, people are gonna have different issues. There's gonna be people who lose their parents. There's gonna be people who come from single parent households. There's gonna be people who are born poor. They don't have the money for college, uni, stuff like that. It is almost impossible to completely make equal opportunity for everyone. But that is the more, in my opinion, that the better approach to be trying to make equal opportunity for everyone rather than equal outcome, because equal outcome ultimately would just end up with people being forced towards roles that they don't like, they're going to be unhappy, and it's just not really possible, because to do it, you're gonna have to pull out people who enjoy where they work, and replace them with people who don't want to be there.
Well, this is basically what happened in every communist country ever, but particularly the sort of Soviet Union, was that in order to achieve equal outcomes, they basically had to keep going after anyone who gained any advantage through any means whatsoever, and they had to force people into work because they realized that people don't do exactly what you expect them to in your sort of utopian plans, and so you have to use severe enforcement to achieve it. And the result of that was the horrors documented in the Gulag Archipelago, where, you know, millions of people were imprisoned for what seemed like trivial infractions because they weren't going along with the communist dream.
And even sometimes just for absolutely no reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
Like,
but the other issue with that is that it doesn't achieve what it sets out to do, because anyone who's grandiose enough to think that they can implement utopia is likely to be overly convinced of their own importance, and so it's highly open to corruption. You attract psychopaths and narcissists to positions of power, make it easy for them to obtain it because there's no safeguards against it.
This is similar to what I was speaking to you about yesterday, where people need a significant element of narcissism to think that they know the perfect solution to any situation, unless it's a very like simple situation like math, like what's 2 + 2, then yeah, sure, you're not a narcissist for thinking you know the answer to that. But in terms of any complex situation, like any trans ideology, critical race theory and stuff like that, to believe that you know the best out of everyone and everyone should follow you, and not have an open mind to think maybe you're wrong. Like, you need to be so like blinded by reality to go around and push it. And you get, like I was telling you about the people in court arguing trans ideology just in the streets, just shouting at people. Like, they had a few good points, but they were basically just shouting at people, and they had like a leaflet that they're handing out that was just like end trans ideology. Like, most people who read that aren't going to understand what the fuck you're on about. They're just going to be like, this person hates trans people, let's like argue with them. And like some of them were just like kids just like handing out these leaflets, and people going up to them with screwing up the leaflets and chucking them and telling them to fuck off. And it's like, the kid's like 15. Like, he's just being told by someone that's like higher up, who's telling him to shout at people and just being like, I know the answer to this. This is going to ruin our kids. Like, everyone needs to believe me. And it's just like, it's just not the way to go about things. And that's why I struggle listening to a lot of people who think they have solutions for complex issues, or like a whole solution. Like, I completely agree with one thing in this book, and that's that we should be reflecting on things that may be problematic, and interacting with people who believe they're problematic and coming to a solution and resolving them and becoming better people from it.
I think that if you in the last chapter, I think it was, there was some guidance on conflict resolution that I thought, if you peel away all of the nonsense and hyperbole and race essentialism that she has layered over the top of it, then what she's saying in terms of be prepared to sit down, listen, hear when you're wrong, and talk these things through is actually fairly good advice. I think that it goes wrong when she says, and depending on your race, you're either guilty or innocent by default, and you should presume that the person confronting you is 100% accurate. And this is another one of the big contradictions within the whole book, is she talks about implicit and unconscious bias frequently when it comes to white people, and then says that doesn't basically acts as if that doesn't exist for anyone else, and everyone else should be completely believed 100% at face value without any question. And that is a contradiction. This is why the lived experience argument annoys me, because it tends to come... First of all, I hate the term lived experience. It's just experience. All experience is lived. So that's just a attempt by critical social justice activists to reify the idea of experience and try and make it count for evidence rather than just anecdote as we used to know it. But it's inherently hypocritical if you argue to be wary of unconscious bias but to take lived experience as true, because the two things contradict each other.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No.
I was just going to say the thing that just reminded me of when you said that they must be right whenever they bring it up, is that she actually doesn't say that about black men. She only says it about black women. And the one thing that, probably the thing that grinded me the most out of this whole book, was when she was talking about white women's tears and how feeling guilty for the oppression of black people as a white woman is a negative thing and your tears are offensive, blah, blah, blah. But then she says that when men rush to the aid of this white woman who's crying over this guilt, they are reinforcing the fact that the white woman is the most important person in this scenario. And then she says a black guy going up to a white woman who's crying is just manipulated by the patriarchy and institutional racism. So she's basically saying the only people that can be 100% right all the time about racism is black women.
Well, this is the another contradiction throughout the book, where throughout the book, white people have absolute agency and responsibility for all of their actions, but black people, all of their actions are the responsibility of white people, and it basically infantilizes black people as if they have no agency over their own decisions or lives whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, if you could just pass me the book. Oh, sorry. Professional. I should have brought mine with me. But there was a quote on it that I thought basically summarized not just her position, but the position of critical race theory in general. It's this paragraph here. It says, "In my work to unravel the dynamics of racism, I have found a question that never fails me. The question is not, is this claim true or is it false? We will never come to an agreement on a question that sets up an either-or dichotomy on something as sensitive as racism. Instead, I ask, how does this claim function in the conversation?" Her basic point here, and you see this throughout not just this book, but most things that are influenced by postmodernism, certainly within the critical social justice sphere, is it's basically saying there's no such thing as objective reality. True or false doesn't matter. We're not going to agree on it because it's all subjective. What matters is whether I can use this information. Its utility is the important thing to it. So she's basically saying, I don't care if anything I say is true or false as long as it serves the purpose I'm aiming for. that is the underlying message of that, and that is to my understanding, the basis for her entire ideology.
Yeah, and she's utilised it pretty fucking well, and she's made a lot of money from it.
Yeah,
she hasn't just written a book; she's also done all of her racial talks in loads of companies like Google and basically all the big companies, and probably loads of little ones as well. And she's got to throw her weight around and tell people they're racist.
Outsized cultural influence without qualification for it.
Yeah, because she is the saviour of all black people everywhere.
Yeah. Right, I think we should probably leave it there because we're running out of time.
Yeah, sounds good.
But it was a pleasure, and thank you for forcing me to read this book. I think it...
all that complaining for the past 48 hours has really paid off. You might get 10 views on this podcast. It's important to understand things you're criticising and to give them their due consideration, because otherwise it would just be as reactionary as everyone else, and that's what I'm hoping to sort of improve on and not be part of, because it does my head in. So there is value in doing it. It just so happens that it's probably the worst book I've ever read. It is terribly written. It is terribly argued. It's terribly evidenced, and it's just full of nonsense from start to finish. And it makes it very difficult to read it without feeling the need to exclaim my frustration every 10 minutes. It could have definitely been better summarized in a blog post. Like that's my opinion on it. If she just took the good bits out of it, summarised it in a blog post, sorted.
It would have just been a blank page.
Nah, there's a few good points. You can't be that critical. There's a few good points in that.
I did like, for the last sort of 3 or 4 chapters, it's only a 150-page book, so it's a very small book. And for the last 3 or 4 chapters, she just run out of things to say, and it was basically just summaries of everything that came before, and really long lists of like very basic information. And I was like, she's just run out of steam. She's made her point, and that's it.
Just needed to fill those extra pages.
Yeah. All right, let's leave it there.
Yeah.